India's real threat may not be just Pakistan, but the silent hand of China behind the scenes. From 1965 to today, Beijing has armed, backed, and politically shielded Islamabad, never stepping into war directly, but always standing just close enough. This isn't a future two-front threat. It's been India's reality for decades. Collusive, constant, calculated.
Deep dive. We take your sources and really try to unpack what's going on beneath the surface.
And today we've got a really critical topic, looking at South Asia's strategic picture, China's role, historically, in conflicts between India and Pakistan.
Yeah, it's definitely not just some dusty history lesson.
No, absolutely not. This is directly relevant to understanding regional security today, current events, and, well, frankly, it's essential stuff if you're preparing for exams like India's UPSC, or even if you just want a clearer picture of a pretty complex geopolitical situation.
Exactly. And our guide for this deep dive is an article from the Eurasian Times. We're going to stick strictly to what this one source tells us.
Right.
Our mission, based on this article, is to explore this whole idea of a two-front challenge for India. Has China and Pakistan historically presented one? And if so, was it what the source calls collaborative or more collusive?
Yeah, the source draws a really useful distinction there. Collaborative, that would mean, open military help, maybe even China and Pakistan coordinating joint attacks against India.
Like active allies fighting side by side.
Precisely, forcing India to literally fight on two fronts at the same time.
Okay, and the other type?
The other dimension is collusive. That's less about joint fighting and more about moral support, political backing, providing materials, maybe logistics. It could be open, could be kind of covert.
And the main argument in this Eurasian Times piece right from the start is that historically, China's approach has actually been this collusive one, not the full-blown collaborative partnership in wartime.
That's the core thesis we'll be exploring. So let's walk through the conflicts mentioned in the article, one by one.
Okay. Where does the source start? Does it go back to 47, 48?
It mentions it briefly, mostly to point out that China itself was deep in its own civil war then. Yeah. So the analysis of the People's Republic of China, which was founded in October 49, really begins after that.
Right. So the first major conflict the source looks at involving the PRC is the 1965 war.
Exactly. And the context here is important. This is not long after the 1962 India-China war, and relations between China and Pakistan had been warming up.
And there was that border agreement too, wasn't there?
Yes, the source highlights that. March 1963, Pakistan ceded a part of Indian territory, India claims, but Pakistan occupied in Kashmir to China. We're talking about the Shakespeare Valley or the Trans-Karakoram Tract.
How big an area are we talking about?
The source mentions around 5,180 square kilometers. And crucially, India, of course, doesn't recognize this transfer at all, maintains this claim.
And this area is still relevant today?
Very much so. The source notes that China's Big Belt and Road Initiative, specifically the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, runs right through this region.
Okay, so back to the 65 war itself. What kind of support did China offer Pakistan, according to the article?
Well, it says China gave strong support, verbally and politically. There were even explicit threats mentioned.
Threats? Like what?
Specifically mentioning potential action around the Sikkim border area. The source argues this really constrained India.
Oh.
It suggests these threats basically forced India to keep a large number of its mountain divisions, 5 out of 7, it says, tied down on the northern border, just in case.
Wow. So even the threat had a real impact on India's deployment against Pakistan.
That's the implication in the source, yes. It even suggests the other 2 divisions were held back from full commitment until the ceasefire because of that potential Chinese front.
But did China actually do anything militarily?
And that's the key finding for 65. According to the source. Despite all the noise, the strong words, the strategic pressure, China did not get involved militarily. The support was limited to, moral and political backing.
Okay, so a collusive approach in 65. What about the next major conflict, the 1971 war, the Bangladesh Liberation War? That was a huge turning point.
A very complex situation, yeah.
Yeah.
You had the independence movement in what was then East Pakistan, millions of refugees flooding into India, India backing the Mukti Bahini freedom fighters.
Pakistan attacking India in the West to try and relieve pressure.
Right. And internationally, things were shifting too. Pakistan had helped Kissinger make his secret trip to Beijing earlier that year, strengthening U.S.-China ties, partly against the Soviets.
And Sino-Soviet relations were already terrible. Meanwhile, India signed its treaty with the Soviet Union in August '71.
The Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation. All of this forms the backdrop. And the source highlights something specific from China. A letter from Premier Chow Enlai to Pakistan's leaders back in April '71.
Oh, interesting. What did the letter say, according to the source?
Well, it quotes some pretty strong language. It apparently referred to East and West Pakistan as basic guarantees for the country's future, dismissed the independence movement as just a handful of people causing trouble.
And blamed others.
Yes, it reportedly blamed India and the Soviet Union for gross interference. And crucially, it offered an assurance of China's total support if Pakistan faced, and I quote from the source here, aggression of the Indian expansionists.
Total support. That sounds pretty collaborative on paper. But again, the key question based on the source: what did China actually do when the war broke out?
And again, the source states very clearly, China did not intervene militarily.
No troops, no attacks?
No. What it did do, according to the article, was provide weapons and equipment. It also allowed Pakistani Air Force planes to use its airspace for overflights.
Any other involvement mentioned?
The source mentions reports near the war's end about Chinese rescue ships possibly gathering in the Bay of Bengal. The speculation was they might be there to evacuate Pakistani troops, though it adds that Moscow apparently told Delhi not to target them if that was their only mission.
So assistance, facilitation, maybe contingency planning, but no direct fighting.
Exactly. Still fitting that collusive pattern rather than collaborative.
And what about after the war? Pakistan surrendered in Dhaka on December 16th. How did China react then, based on the source?
The language quoted is pretty harsh. China apparently condemned the Soviet Union's shameful role, calling Moscow the backstage manager for India.
So doubling down on the political rhetoric.
Very much so. It reportedly claimed that the creation of Bangladesh was just the start of endless strife in the region, and even predicted this would lead to India's ultimate defeat. Strong words.
Despite the outcome of the war itself, did the source mention specific military aid provided around that time?
It does cite some figures reported for 1971-72, things like 200 military instructors for guerrilla training, large amounts of ammunition, 200,000 rounds for anti-aircraft and tanks in the last week alone, it says.
Wow.
And estimates of major equipment like 225 T-59 tanks, some II-28 bombers, MiG-19 fighters, riverboats, plus help with building ordnance factories in Pakistan.
So significant material support continued or even ramped up after the war.
Seems so, based on these reports cited in the source. But the article's main conclusion for 71 remains the same. China talked tough, gave that assurance in the letter, provided arms, but ultimately did not carry out the threat of direct military involvement.
Okay, let's jump forward quite a bit then. The 1999 Kargil War. How does the source describe China's position during that conflict?
This is where the source notes a potential shift. It describes China's stance in Kargil as arguably more neutral, especially compared to 65 and 71.
Neutral? That sounds quite different. Why the change, according to the article? What reasons does it suggest?
It points to a couple of potential factors. One was the reported presence of Uyghur fighters among the Pakistani forces in Kargil.
Ah, so China's own internal security concerns related to Xinjiang might have played a role.
That's a key possibility raised by the source, yes. Concerns about Islamic fundamentalism potentially spilling over from that conflict into Xinjiang, or even into the parts of POK near China, including that area ceded back in '63. The source even mentions China protesting to Pakistan about its alleged aid to rebels.
Interesting. So maybe less about the India-Pakistan dynamic and more about China's own worries?
That's certainly an interpretation the source puts forward. In terms of actual support during Kargil, the source mentions very little, basically just permission for Pakistani Air Force overflights again.
And publicly, what was their line?
Publicly, the source says China took a cautious approach. It called for restraint from both sides, insisted that forces should pull back to where they were before the conflict started, and stressed the need for a peaceful settlement.
Okay. Now, the source also touches on a more recent conflict, doesn't it? It refers to something called Operation Sindoor in May 2025.
Yes. It discusses China's reaction to that reported event. Officially, Beijing's response, as described in the source, was again quite measured. They called the Indian actions regrettable and urged calm and restraint.
And the source contrasts this language.
It does. It points out that this kind of language is quite different, much milder than what China typically uses when talking about, say, Taiwan or the South China Sea disputes. More detached, perhaps.
But was that the whole picture?
Well, the source draws a distinction. That was the official stance. But it then discusses the information space, particularly Chinese social media and bloggers.
And what was happening there?
The reactions described there were apparently quite different. The source uses words like nasty and brutish, often very anti-India, sometimes claiming Pakistan had somehow won because of the advanced weapons China had supplied.
Which weapons specifically?
The source specifically mentions the J-10C fighter jets and their missile capabilities being touted online as game changers provided by China.
And the article connects this to actual arms sales data.
Yes, it provides context with figures. It notes China was the world's fourth largest arms exporter between 2020 and 2024, and that Pakistan was by far its biggest customer, taking in 63% of China's total arms exports.
Two-thirds, basically.
Pretty much. And it gives a figure, $8.2 billion worth of arms sold from China to Pakistan just since 2015. So the material support is clearly ongoing and substantial.
Okay, so let's synthesize this. We've gone through 65, 71, 99, and this recent 2025 event mentioned in the source. How does the article pull these threads together to support its main argument about the collusive versus collaborative approach?
Well, the pattern the source identifies across all these conflicts is remarkably consistent. China provides major support, moral, political, diplomatic, and very significant material support through arms and aid. But, and this is the crucial part according to the source, it consistently stops short of direct military intervention alongside Pakistan.
So always playing the role of a powerful backer, but never quite stepping onto the battlefield itself.
That's the essence of the collusive partner argument presented in the source.
And looking ahead, what does the source say about the chances of this changing? Could China shift from this historical collusive role to a genuinely collaborative military partnership with Pakistan against India in the future?
The source assesses that possibility as remote.
Remote. Why does it think that? What reasons does it give?
Two main lines of reasoning are presented. First, China's global ambitions. It wants to be seen, the source suggests, as a kind of benevolent superpower on the world stage. Getting directly involved militarily in a messy regional conflict like India-Pakistan could seriously damage that image.
Okay, the global image concern. What's the second reason?
The second is more hard-nosed strategy. The source points to the potentially enormous costs and strategic risks for China if it actually engaged in a two-front war against India, especially given that both India and Pakistan are nuclear powers and China is too. The potential for escalation would be immense.
That makes sense. It's interesting, too, you often hear that phrase about the China-Pakistan friendship being higher than the Himalayas, deeper than the ocean.
Right, the source mentions that rhetoric.
But despite that very close relationship, the source points out that China and Pakistan have never actually signed a formal military alliance, like a mutual defense treaty.
Exactly. And the source uses that fact, the absence of a formal treaty obligation, as further evidence reinforcing its argument. It suggests that the relationship, at least in the context of potential war with India, has stayed within the bounds of collusion, not full collaboration.
So this deep dive, based purely on this Eurasian Times article, really highlights that historical pattern. Understanding this distinction, consistent collusive support, but a repeated pulling back from collaborative military action seems vital.
Absolutely. It provides crucial context for navigating current affairs. And as we said, it's definitely key knowledge if you're tackling exams like the UPSC, where you need that kind of strategic depth. And just to reiterate, this whole analysis is drawn strictly from the source material provided. We're just presenting the arguments in history as laid out in that article.
Right, impartially conveying what the source claims.
And the consistency of this collusive pattern over decades, plus the source's view that a shift is unlikely, really tells you something about the nature of the strategic challenge India faces, according to this analysis.
Yeah, it's a really important nuance. The article seems to suggest that while India absolutely has to factor in China's significant backing for Pakistan, which definitely complicates things, the specific scenario of China launching a coordinated offensive with Pakistan simultaneously.
That specific scenario, based on this source's historical reading and future assessment, appears less likely than perhaps commonly assumed. The two-front pressure exists, but it manifests differently.
More as strategic weight and material support from one side rather than two coordinated military actors.
Precisely. It's about managing that dynamic, the primary conflict, plus the powerful backer, which is still a huge challenge, just a different kind that a fully collaborative military alliance would pose.
Well, there you have it. Our deep dive into China's historical role in India-Pakistan conflicts, focusing on that collusive versus collaborative framework, all based on the insights from the Eurasian Times article.
We really hope walking through the sources analysis like this has helped clarify some of the complexities and given you some solid takeaways.
Definitely. And if you found this breakdown useful, please do give this video or audio a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more deep dives like this.
And leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts, or if you have any questions specifically about the source material we discussed today, or even suggestions for other sources or topics you'd like us to explore.
Your engagement really makes a difference. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.